We have a great guest now. He's former Gallup pollster David Moore. He's a senior fellow with the Carsey Institute at the University of New Hampshire. As I mentioned, he was former vice president of the Gallup organization and managing editor of the Gallup poll, where he worked from 1993 to 2006. His new book is called The Opinion Makers. An insider exposes the truth behind the polls. Skepticalpollster.com is the website. And David, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Carl.
I really enjoyed your book. They couldn't pry this book away from me last night while I was reading it. I'm very much into it. And you say, quote, it's urgent that we make polls monitor rather than manipulate the pulse of democracy. And tell us what you mean by that, and especially why polls so far away from elections don't mean much.
Well, those are two different questions, but they're obviously related. I think the polls don't mean very much far away from the election, even now with all these so-called convention bounces, because the pollsters refuse to measure the undecided vote. They always pressure respondents in a sample into giving some kind of a name, even if they don't have a decision. And not only that, instead of saying, who are you going to vote for in November, they say, who are you going to vote for if the election were held today?
Right.
Well, I mean, that really... It's an admission by the pollsters that they know that if they asked people who they were going to vote for in November, a lot of people would admit they simply don't know. They're still thinking about it.
Right. So we see these polls right now. It's like 48-48. That's just nonsense because there's so many more out there who are undecided. And you say they give them this hypothetical, this forced choice hypothetical if the election were held today. And what if they still don't know? What do? They pressure them even further?
Well, they do. They say, well, who do you lean toward? And so people will play the game. They know that if they're in a polling situation and the pollsters are asking them questions or the interviewers are asking them questions, that either you're going to play the game, either that or you're going to hang up and not be part of the poll.
Right.
And by the way, that happens to be true. Typically, the response rate in polls these days is somewhere below 20%, which means that only about 1 out of 5 of the people that you're supposed to contact actually are included in the sample.
Right.
So 80% of the people you intend to contact are not included.
So all these polling organizations that say, 98% have decided, that's all just nonsense.
It is nonsense, right. It's true. And they'll get around it sometimes by kind of the back-ended way. They'll say, now that they force people to make a choice if the election were held today, then say, some will do this, not all. Is that a firm decision or could you change your mind? When they do that, they sometimes find, as CBS did, that somewhere around 35 to 40% of the people, right before the convention, around 35 to 40% of the voters admitted that they, could change their mind, that they really hadn't made up their mind who they were going to vote for in November. So they can get around it a little bit, but I still think they manufacture the opinion right up front so that they have more stories to tell.
By the way, we want all Democrats voting in November, all Republicans voting in December. So that's the way we like it here.
Okay.
We're progressive radio.
That's a good ploy if you can make it work.
If we could do it. Yeah. David, what about the convention bounces? We've heard so much about that. You say these are nonsense, too.
Yeah, I think that they're not really accurate reflections. What it appears to be, just to take a step back and looking at the convention bounces, is it appears as though we've got an American electorate that keeps flitting from one candidate to the other, depending upon who happens to get the media attention. But I think that what's happened is that when pollsters are asking their sample of voters, it's only a sample, they're asking those people who you're going to vote for if the election were held today, and they're forced, kind of pressured into coming up with some decision. Well, if they've just seen all this positive coverage about Sarah Palin and about John McCain, then they say, okay, I guess I'm voting for McCain.
Right.
Now, these are undecided voters, truly undecided, but they're being forced to come up with a name.
Right.
So, the previous week when they had all the positive coverage about Obama and Biden,
they were hearing things about Obama, so he was in their mind. Right.
Right. And so the undecided voters said, okay, well, if I have to decide today, I suppose I'd go with that. And so it makes it appear as though, the polls make it appear as though voters are actually changing their minds, moving from one candidate to another, when in fact what's happening, I think, is just that the undecided voters in the samples are being pressured to come up with a name. They come up with the name they've heard most recently. The next week, you get a new sample of voters, and you got also undecided voters among that group, and they are also pressured, so they come up with McCain's name. So it's not, but it's not really a reflection of the voters who don't participate in the polls. The undecided voters who don't participate in the polls probably haven't made up their mind one way or the other and are still waiting to see more from the candidates before they do make up their mind.
David, what about exit polls? You know, in 2000 and 2004, we heard a lot about exit polls and how they used to be so accurate. And then, of course, we had the election issues. Can you address that issue? Are they accurate, or were they in the past accurate and are not so much anymore?
The exit polls have never been very accurate. We have to distinguish in the exit polls from the election night forecasting. The exit polls were only used as a kind of a preliminary idea of, or give a preliminary evidence of what the polls would look like in each individual state. But typically the exit polls have been pretty far off. The reason we don't necessarily hear about how badly the exit polls perform is that, generally speaking, the networks would refrain from calling a state or projecting the winner in the state based solely on the exit polls. The exit polls would be the first bit of information they would get, and if the exit poll showed an overwhelming victory for one candidate and the other, for example, in Mississippi, you know that a Republican's going to win, or in Massachusetts, you're almost sure a Democrat's going to win, well, then they would go ahead and call the state based on the exit poll. But if it was pretty close, then they would wait to get the actual vote count. And they would wait until they got enough of the vote count to go ahead and make the projections. What happened in 2000 was that they made a projection based upon the vote count that was erroneous. What happened in 2004 is all those exit polls leaked. The information was leaked out. It should never have been, leaked out because they're just not very accurate. Everybody who didn't know how inaccurate they could be tended to believe them, and but of course they turned out to be wrong.
We're speaking with former Gallup pollster David Moore. His book is The Opinion Makers. An Insider Exposes the Truth Behind the Polls. SkepticalPollster.com is the website. David, only about a minute and a half. I got a couple questions for you here. Our listeners always want to know about people with cell phones only, no landlines. How do the polling companies deal with that?
Well, most polling companies do not include cell phone-only users. And there's some research that suggests that, at least with respect to projecting elections, we don't necessarily underestimate the youth vote because they get weighted up by young people who have landlines. But other research suggests, it's a real problem right now. You got up to maybe 40% of young people who have cell phone-only users, and that's increasing more and more across the country. There's only one Gallup in January of this year said that they are going to include cell phone-only users in their sample, but all the other polling organizations do not, and I think it's going to be a serious problem. I don't know if in this election, but it certainly will be a serious problem down the road. One
quick question, and I'm sorry we're running out of time because this is fascinating, but you talk about how in your book, The Opinion Makers, how polls misrepresent public opinion on policy. And just tell us very briefly, and we really have less than a minute, how every major media poll showed support for a preemptive strike against Iraq, yet there was no support in the country.
No, the public was evenly divided. About 30% of the public was in favor of the war and would be upset if we didn't go. 30% were opposed and would be upset if we did go to war.
But it all sounded like the whole public was for it,
Yeah. Well, I know, but that's because and then about 40% said they didn't have an opinion one way or the other. The reason it appeared as though the public was for it is that there was a forced choice question again, and people who even didn't have an opinion on it were essentially pressured into giving one. And they'd been hearing about the war. They said, okay, well, I guess I support the war. But it wasn't a real reflection of what the underlying commitment of the public was to one side or another.
And that goes back to the quote I had originally, it's urgent that we make polls monitor, not manipulate the pulse of democracy.
Absolutely. That's definitely the
David, thanks for joining us. I really recommend the book. It's called The Opinion Makers. An Insider Exposes the Truth Behind the Polls. SkepticalPollster.com is the website. David Moore has been our guest. David, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Carl.
Thank you. Sure. It's 7:17 on AM 620 KPOJ. And let's face it, not every